Yo, let's dive into
Sure.
a little bit more of God as a Woman, because you wanted to tell me something before we
Yeah.
even started the podcast. What went down with this book?
Oh,
And by the way, if you guys don't know, T.J. McGowan right here, he's a great poet. This is one of his published works right here. God is a Woman. You can find it on everywhere, right?
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Wherever Cranston Press is the press that published it. They're based in Chicago. It was interesting. I was writing this. There was a couple different things in my mind when I was writing it. Not as much in my spoken word, but when I'm like writing poetry, like written read poetry, I don't know if it's like subconsciously. I always revert to like sort of taking some of the ideas of the Roman Catholicism I was raised in and trying to use them in different ways in my poetry for other things. So one thing that so that being said, I wrote in this collection of poems, and it started to just become about like relationships with women, different women, like physical, sexual relationships, uh, platonic, just like it became all this sort of like they were just coming out through this vein of like trying to write them either like prayers or what, I don't know. And it was like kind of like a mixture, and I had never written in that way before. And then another poet friend of mine, she was sort of like, oh, like keep pushing that, like and exploring that, and like don't really hold back and that sort of stuff. And then a lot of it emerged from that, and sort of then started to become, for lack of a better word, like not like an erotic poetry book, but a lot of it was just like steering itself towards like a liberation of that part of me that I never really would put in writing a lot, either from like apprehensiveness or not thinking I could write it correctly or whatever it was. So many of them focus on like physical relationships, desire, trust, that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing was that two female poets were kind of behind the scenes helping me cultivate what I was writing, because I kind of felt like I also needed to have a perspective in which I wasn't just like writing like male gaze, like smutty kind of like, I wanted like, it was supposed to be sort of, even when it went into like the physical and the desire and all that sort of stuff, was trying to have, always having them kind of review to make sure I wasn't like straying too far from what I thought I was doing. And then there was an open call, and I submitted to the press, and they were awesome and hit me back. And I think at the time, and I would have to ask Emily, they were female run, female published. I think I was like one of the first guys.
Wow.
And I actually at a time like felt it was like this responsibility if I was given that spot. And so I was like, I don't want royalties. I don't get royalties on this book. If you buy this book, my royalties basically go to support women's choice. Like I'm pro-choice, so like it goes to an organization that sort of supports that. Planned Parenthood is sort of being, kind of being pulled. So that was like our agreement. I'm not going to get any royalties because like you're giving me a slot that normally would have gone to another woman poet, and it felt like a good exchange that then this money went to like a woman's cause that then was aligned with the press, aligned with my thoughts. So it was like, it was like, hell, well, this is great. And then like the book came out, and one of the first things that always I have to correct is people think it's religious in nature. So then you feel like you got to give them a little bit of a warning, because like there's, a bunch of the poems are about sex, or they're not about religion at all. They're using like religious wording, but to speak more about the idea of like the power, like both like the yes, the physical power of like women, but also everything else that encompasses a woman, in my view of like femininity and the power of femininity and the necessary like how that reflects to me to kind of make me a better man. And so like it was more about that. So like you get to give these people long-winded things, and like if someone's like a religious person to think that, like then it's kind of becomes,
They see the title.
it's like a little blasphemous.
Mm-hmm.
And so one time I had gotten a feedback thing that when it was first announced that straight up was like, that this is a blasphemous title.
Wow.
Because it really wasn't about religion, and I don't know if they were upset that I was saying God was a woman versus God was a man. So there's that hurdle I usually have to get over.
Right.
When I'm in person and someone asks me what about it, it's like, oh, I'm not really religious. That it's you know, it's not what it's about.
Right.
And then like it existed in the world, and then I did the worst thing you could ever do as a writer is read your reviews. And there was like a few that were like, honestly, like knocked me back because they were basic. Like one straight up says like I'm a misogynist.
Really?
And that I was objectifying women the whole book.
What?
And being possessive, and therefore they could like articulate the kind of man I was.
Wow.
And it was like I was like I don't even know this person,
right.
and I'm reading this like interpretation of this thing
that they think of
that was like pretty vulnerable writing for me.
Right.
That was like cultivated with other like women writers that I really respected, that were like pushing me. And then she was like using parts of the review was using like just a couple of lines from one poem to prove that I was like this oppressive, abusive, possessive. And then it's like, oh, once this is out of my hands, my interpretation is not everybody's interpretation. And it was really hard for me to, and I even reached back out to the publisher and was like, did I cause you any issues with this book? Because, and then she was like, no, like we took it because we loved the book. We loved like what you were writing and all this sort of stuff. And like they saw it the way I saw it.
Right.
And then she, she had to kind of like help me
navigate.
Like just that like a review is someone else's interpretation of your work. But it was interesting because it was like, just like one passage they were using about basically, saying that I was controlling, oppressive, misogynistic. And the piece itself, it's so bizarre because like it's a piece that like I remember going over with 3 different, including the publisher, like female writers, and this, and like actually having them like letting me plunge like sort of like the cerebral nature of what I was trying to get at, and the idea that the idea of the piece was that true trust in a physical relationship is the power. That like if a woman trusts you enough in the physical aspect of your relationship to explore it, they do that out of actually not fearing you. And therefore that power dynamic can continuously shift between the two of you. You know, like that's what that particular piece is about. But if you just read like the 3 lines that talk about more like possession, I guess that's what you could get out of it. But it was just like a mind-blowing thing to me that like so much had gone into like that particular piece about trying to sort of base it on experiences that were fueling it off of my inquisitiveness with other female writers that I respected about that kind of dynamic, right? Like in the kind of like power play of like a physical relationship, and how many times you allow your partner to explore different things out of the basis of trust. And because you're actually not fearing them in that moment. You're saying together we're exploring these things together. And that push and that kind of trade between us is actually what's sexy. Is that's the power there. And this kind of relinquishing of each other depending on who is
that is because it shows us a level of confidence, right, in the other person that not only you have within yourself, but that the other person has. Particularly
in when you're having the dialogue, like I was with the several women that kind of like were, I guess my sensitivity readers is like what they call it, like to a degree, was in those conversations where like they were reaffirming that like, oh yeah, like if I'm with somebody that I actually trust them with my like safety and security, and how like they become even more powerful. And maybe I just you start to think like maybe I just didn't hone in the way I really needed to, or everything just ultimately still will have the gaze of the shoes you walk in. So like they'll still always be, you'll never be able to sort of fully. But at the time, it was like I was actually kind of like mortified that like there was people going to read the book and like think that stuff about me, or read the review and be like, think that I'm like, I don't know, like some monster, and not sort of, and you're like, fuck, like how, like I can't have this conversation about that poem with every single person that reads this book, and so I can't control their interpretation.
Right. Everyone's traumatized differently.
And I had to figure. Well, that was the other thing too. It's like, this is someone that's reading it from a perspective that I don't have, and so like that could be jarring to them. Where like their experience with men and physical relationships is not is a violent, awful thing. There's, so you're like, it's all perspective. But it was just like, I was like, oh my god, like I fucked up so royally with this book, and like I was really like in my head where I was like, man. Wow. And then what I mean, like I'm asking like Elise, I'm like, was this a mistake? That like I wrote this, was I maybe not at the level of writer I needed to be when I was tackling this stuff? Did I not do it eloquently enough? And it was just kind of like an odd sort of thing where in my mind, you think like, oh, well, like a handful of women I know like kind of signed off on it. So you're like, again, it's like, that doesn't mean every person that reads is going to like it or is going to pull the same thing from it. Where ultimately I was trying to say, like, the experience of those conversations I was having was that women were saying that, or those particular, like that they actually often felt the most powerful when they felt safe enough to kind of relinquish that to a trusting partner.
Absolutely.
And so
makes sense.
And I guess it's like not always an easy thing to maybe write about, or I just maybe I missed the marks a couple places. So
I think you did a great job, man.
So I have a really odd relationship with this book.
I'm glad I brought it out then. The thing is that people just they only know as much as they can know, right? If you haven't gathered that experience upon yourself, of course, sometimes you could say the right thing, and to other people, it'll always be bad.
Sure.
It's one of those weird, I don't know if this is the right word, dichotomy of life.
Sure.
Where it's like one people can have a certain experience, and the other person can have a completely different experience looking at the same thing.
And the other thing, the one thing I will say that other reviews that were not as like harsh as that one, was that why I could see someone had talked about, and it's probably because I was trying to do this whole playful, like not playful thing, but play with the idea of church that I grew up in, and how can I apply that to the idea that like feminine power is like the ultimate like godly thing, where it can come off as solely worship, and not necessarily, I guess something a little bit more balanced. Where I could see that, where I could agree that maybe I was leaning too much into this, let me mess around with religion and church and terminology when I was like an altar boy, and figure out how I can apply that to this idea that like femininity can be the ultimate like godly power and stuff, and to a degree that works, but then to a degree it doesn't, because then you can kind of say like, well, if I'm trying to comment on the opiate of the masses kind of hive mind of religion, sometimes if I'm then applying that to this, and I'm not doing it in a nuanced enough way, it could almost look like blind worship, and not a like penetrative like way to understand like the feminine power, which was a separate review that I got that was more like I felt I could learn from that review, where I was like, maybe I did lean too much into this, and so now it's coming off the wrong way, because I might have done too much of that and didn't rein it in to try to be where it was not just like a blind worship book, where like there was nothing other cerebral going on. I could see. So regardless, all writing is like growing and a learning experience. Absolutely. It's out there. It exists.
The growing pain, right?
You know, there's, you know, but, you know, as I approach other things, or it broadens my toolbox as a writer and as a person to just make, you know, check a few more boxes, take a little bit more time to breathe, like try to grow myself as to like, so yeah, it's created like an odd relationship I have with the book, because it was, as much as you know that something can be interpreted otherwise, or even that I've probably interpreted other people's works of arts, like the first time there's like a confirmation of that, I was like, oh shit, this is not what I meant at all. And then you're like, every person that's gonna read this book thinks I'm like, I like the total opposite of the person I am.
Yeah. Because
poetry is interpretive, and if you leave, you know, it's much more vague than other poetry I write. Because I was trying to write things in kind of like a prairie, psalmy kind of way. So there's less like specific details to my life.
Okay.
Which then I feel like allows a broader interpretation of your art, if you're kind of, particularly in poetry, if you're really pulling the specific details of your life out and leaving kind of the vague descriptive nature of it. As sultry as it can make it, it can also allow someone to interpret it however they
want.
Which then I have to say, like, I guess, you know, you're reading, like, there's like the mechanical, technical interpretation, I guess, in my head, but that once it's somebody else's, like, my interpretation really doesn't matter, because again, I can't have a conversation with everybody that we're having to explain every aspect of it, to be like, don't hate me. I promise it's not that, you know. But it definitely shook me a little bit in good, and, you know, probably reflectively better, because now I can approach things a little bit more carefully. Just,
does that make you feel that way? See, like for me, I feel like my experience in life is that when that happens, it kind of makes me do the opposite, to be honest, because it gets me a little bit annoyed that, like, sometimes that I have to beat around the bush so much or tippy toe about certain things, because it makes me feel like, okay, so now I'm not allowed to be me. You know?
Well, no, I definitely went through every emotion you could reading that kind of stuff.
Right.
But internally to myself. Until you speak to other people. You speak, you know, you gotta go back and speak to the publisher. I go back to speak to the other people that were helping me kind of cultivated, or and you take a breath, and then you have to, like, you parse apart, like, what you can learn from criticism, and what, you know, like learning from critique doesn't necessarily change like who you are. In a way, you could look at it as it'll make you like the better version
of you.
You know, like the more like those critiques don't come out of thin air, and I have nothing against those critiques. At the time, it was just like, oh, whoa, like I finally gotten proof that someone can interpret something different than the way I intended it. But then you have to dig through that and say, like, all right, like, can these critiques shape a better focus on my intent? Won't necessarily change who I am, and it might only change me for the better as a writer and as a person, you know, pulling from other experiences to kind of fold them in. If I ever approach a similar type of concept, you know, where you kind of need, you're writing about yourself, but you're writing about the experience that involves other people, whether it's a relationship with yourself. You want to be able to sort of like approach that like semi-democratically. It's obviously still who you are. But if there's ever a critique that could help you focus in better on your intent, that doesn't mean it's changing your intent, it's sharpening the intent. That's why I say, you know, like I look back after all those floods of emotions, reading things, because you could also find reviews where people enjoyed this book and liked this book. Those, you know, but then basically trying to look beyond the sting of like a bad review and instead be, you know, is there something worth mining here of why this missed the mark for somebody? And could I have sharpened my focus so that it didn't miss the mark?
Mm-hmm.
Which then you get stuck in the like, you would never put anything out if all you ever did was constantly sharpen the blade.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to kind of let things go. And I know I'm not like the person that the review might have thought I was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. Like if they, you know, because again, I'm not in that person's shoes.
Yeah.
And they're interpreting it from their walk of life. And I don't know what they've had to deal with
Personally,
from like a man, or the idea of a man writing about like femininity and maybe feeling like, you know, you're leaping into other shoes as like a reflection to something about yourself, which then ultimately the book still becomes like the perspective of a man about this idea of like feminine power, you know. So there's always going to maybe be a blind spot with writing that involves like that kind of duality. Yeah, I think like art criticism is necessary, and that there's a difference between someone being cruel and then someone writing something that is of a perspective that had them interpreted a certain way, and kind of you can learn from that. Because like there's constructive criticism and then there's not. Yeah. So like, you know, it's now become constructive for me. It's just in the moment, you know, when you're like, oh shit, like
this is real.
Because in your mind you're like you're just kind of like, well, it was a bizarre thing because it was like I'm being described as something that's furthest from like the type of guy I am.
Yeah.
You know, it was like an odd kind of thing, and it was like, you know, but perspective, interpreting poetry, you know, it becomes the readers.
Absolutely,
it's a little different than like if you're reading you know, a fictional novel, or you know, something that's concretely telling you like this is happening and this is happening. You know, you can criticize form and function and plot and all this sort of stuff, right? But you're still going to kind of interpret a lot of it like based on the concrete information you're given. Where poetry, you know, once you let that out there, at the same time, that's part of the beauty of it, is that people can interpret it however they see fit. Because you're kind of, you know, like poetry to me is it's like the language of each individual poet's like heart and mind. And so like you're basically being like, here's my specific foreign language, and like some people are gonna pick it up, and completely be on the same wavelength.
That's so true.
And then some people are gonna be like, well, this is what I got from this.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, and that has to be valid too.
Yeah.
You know, particularly if it turns people off.
Right.
And that has to be okay.
You have to be okay with it.
But I'm definitely not any of those things.
I just want to let you know.
You can ask my fiance.
Yo, yeah.
Well, that was the thing. It was like not just shocking to me. I felt like it was shocking to like the other women that had helped me along the way with this.
Like, what the hell?
We're kind of like, oh, whoa. But then being like, hey, like, you know, we're only like a handful of other writers helping you out here.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't mean, you know, we're not the blanket statement of all women out there.
Yeah, it would be impossible to find that.
And so I see some of the missteps.
No, I think you did great, man. I think like that's part of life, right? Like you said, you had to go through it. You see what you've learned, and I'm pretty sure it definitely helped you on your further works.